Today I'm going to be presenting about the connection between water, um, activism, local communities, the environmental impact of data infrastructure and technological infrastructure in general. Um, what I'm going to try to do here, and the reason why I'm bringing this idea of elemental resistance, which might sound a bit obscure sometimes, is because when I did fieldwork last year, I visited Chile, Mexico, and other Latin American countries. And in Chile, in particular, I met two groups that I found super interesting when it comes to analyzing the environmental impact of technology. And one of them was a local community in Santiago, the capital of Chile, opposing a data center, the construction of a Google data center. And on the other hand, indigenous communities, Lickan Antay Indigenous communities in the Atacama Desert, opposing the extraction of lithium. Actually, the background that you see on my screen on the presentation comes from the Atacama Desert. So this is how lithium is extracted from the deserts through brines. Probably some of you already know, but lithium is used for rechargeable batteries, and since 2015, there has been a huge boom in the extraction of lithium because of electric cars, and this is, of course, having important impacts on the environment. So when I got in touch with these different communities, what all of them were trying to do was to focus a lot on water, on the massive use of water done by implied in this sort of extraction in the case of lithium, or in the construction of this data center. Um, and that's of course like an objective fact that you can tell, but also they use water in very strategic ways. And this is what I'm going to be talking today about, how they are mobilizing water in order to mobilize people against the environmental impact of technology. So this is what I'm going to be talking today. First, I want to unpack a little bit what I mean by terricidal technologies, because I think it's important to frame the problem to see what's at stake here. And then I'm going to be introducing the idea of elemental thinking, and then looking at the two cases that I already mentioned. And then I'm going to be kind of defining elemental resistance and why it matters, and then bringing up some conclusions. Okay, so first, terricidal technologies. Why do I use these concepts? There are other ones, such as, for example, the technocene, that are also interesting. But in case I'm getting inspiration by Moira Millán, who is a Mapuche activist in the south of Latin America, who talks about the terricide. And the reason why I think it's interesting to talk about the terricide, because it involves three different things that not many frameworks address. So the first of them is the fact that what we are living at the moment is an erosion of the earth, a destruction of the earth, right? So this is the geophysical aspect of it. So we can see, for example, how different technologies are, for example, using large-scale natural resources such as water, for example, or polluting the environment. So there's new forms of interaction between technologies and the environment. E-waste is another example, for example, of this type of geophysical interactions. But then there's another more historical dynamic that Moira Millán takes into account, which is extractivism, which is usually the appropriation of natural resources by a core, usually the global north, in a periphery. I won't really discuss much about this, but it's important to bring this into account in order to take into consideration the historical roots of the problem that we're facing when it comes to the environment. And the third aspect that I think is also super important is the imposition of the one world. People from science and technology studies might be more familiar with this, but basically there is this idea that in modernity that there is nature on the one hand and culture on the other hand. And that's something completely new that was sort of invented during modernity, but that is completely different to the way many indigenous communities think about their relationship with the land, when for them, nature and culture are not opposed or binary constructions, but rather are constantly interacting with each other, what some people will call relational technologies. So what Moira Millán basically says is that during modernity, there has been a systemic destruction of worlds that are not modern ones. So basically worlds where there's an actual interaction between the environment and the local communities inhabiting them. So these, I think, are the three aspects of the problem that we are facing at the moment when it comes to the environment, at least as seen from the Latin American perspective. And I'm going to try to bring them into the discussion today and in the analysis of the case that I'm going to be doing. So elemental thinking, why does it matter? Why am I talking about the elements? And first, I think it's important to define what is an element. So elements are substances, places, archetypes, letters, opposites, and chemicals. Something fundamental, ultimate, or basic, that is elemental. So when we think about elemental thinking, for example, usually we tend to think of Greek philosophy, for example, where Plato or Aristotle will talk about, for example, fire, water, their different properties, and so on. So we can think of elements as the constituents of the physical realm. Today, I'm going to be talking about elements in relation to the physical realm, but we can also think of the elements that make up technology. So when we talk about infrastructure of technology, for example, some of its elements will be, for example, fiber optic cables, data centers, and so on, that make up technology or technological systems as we know them. So there has been, according to some philosophers, a return of elemental thinking, also in the social sciences. I am adding here a question mark after return, because of course there has been a lot of communities and people who have been thinking in elemental terms throughout modernity, especially indigenous communities, for example, but we can even think of astrology, right? Like different, in astrology, certain planets, for example, are associated to certain elements and so on. So it has been more present that we can think of. And why some people think that we should return to this way of thinking is because it's a less abstract way of thinking about the environment. So when we talk about the environment, it sounds like a huge thing that is like very difficult to address or to pinpoint. Instead, we are usually interacting with elements. I mean, when we go to the shower, we can see the water, feel it. Same with fire, for example, metals, and so on. So it's a more concrete way of thinking about thinking about the environment. And there have been people within media or infrastructure studies in STS thinking of trying to put forward the idea of elemental analysis, or as Nicole Starosielski says, the investigation of media's material and conditioning substrates. I'm also citing Mel here, who already talked in this series, who has been one of the main people using this type of framework. So that's elemental thinking. But today I'm more interested not about philosophy or the social sciences, but rather how a local community is thinking about the elements and technology. And more broadly, what can elemental thinking bring to their assistance against the terricidal technologies? Why would it matter to look at the elements in this case? So the first case that I'm going to be talking today comes from Santiago, as I said, the capital of Chile. And it's a group of coming from a local community who organized against the construction of a data center, of a Google data center. So in 2019, Google announced that it wanted to construct a data center in Cerrillos, which is the name of this community. It is a working class area. And one of the problems with this data center is that when the local community read about the environmental report, that they realized that it was going to use a lot of water. I'm going to be discussing a bit later today about how much specifically, but that was the main conflict that they identified. And then they created this group just because of the data center, which was called MOSACAT, or Communitarian Social Environmental Movement for Water and the Territory. And they organized protests, disseminated information. They at the beginning, they did not have all the support of the community. I mean, many people in the community saw this data center, as Jenna was talking on Friday, as synonymous with progress, development, more jobs, and so on. So it was super difficult for them to raise awareness among the community about the environmental impact of this data center. The mayor of the municipality, even the president, Sebastián Piñera, by them supported the project. So they really had to make a lot of work in order to get themselves heard. And in December of 2019, there was a municipality referendum when actually neighbors opposed the construction of the data center. Almost 50% of them voted against the construction of this data center. But this vote was not non-binding, so it was only last year when Google finally announced that it was going to use a different system of a different cooling system. So I'm gonna show you some quotes now that stem from two in-depth interviews that I held with two activists, but also I joined them in different protests, for example, and organized with them a participatory workshop. And I'm also drawing on some material that they elaborated. So that's the first case. The second case comes from the Atacama Desert, as I said, and relates to the extraction of lithium. So the Salar de Atacama in the Atacama Desert has a quarter of the global reserves of lithium. So for that reason, countries such as China, the US, and some European countries are super interested at the moment in signing partnerships and getting into that area in Chile. The problem with this form of lithium extraction is that it's super water intensive. That's because the way it's done is through brine pumping. So they pump the water from below the ground, and then they create this some sort of pools that you are seeing on the screen, and they wait for these pools for the water to evaporate, and then what is left on the ground is lithium along with other metals. But that uses a lot of water in a desert, which is actually the most arid desert in the world. Lithium extraction has been taking place for decades, but it became more problematic since 2015 because of the construction of electric cars, which use a lot of lithium. And that really changed a little bit the dynamics between the mining companies and the local community. This is having very important consequences for the environment and the communities there. For example, they have seen some flamingo colonies getting affected, some previous oases that are facing drought at the moment, and it's also really affecting community life. So Lickan Antay Indigenous communities used to have a very community-oriented form of life and so on, and the violent installation of this mining and the arrival of these companies and so on have really changed the lifestyle of the communities there. So when I visited the Atacama Desert, I mainly talked to people living in Toconao and Peine, which are two small towns, and to people from the Council of Atacameño or Lickan Antay people as well. In contrast to the previous case, indigenous communities here have privileged more negotiations with companies rather than organizing protests or trying to draw media attention. So they have been more low profile, so to speak. One potential explanation for that is because they depend on these companies. In some communities, for example, Peine, almost 80% of the people depend materially or work for these companies. So they have not much opportunity in order to enact a more aggressive, so to speak, kind of activism. And in this case, I did 3 in-depth interviews and also drew on media material. So in my previous research about astronomy data, I also talked to these communities, but in relation to the construction of observatories and the management of data. But in this case, I talked to them about the extraction of lithium. I just wanted to paste here this tweet by Elon Musk that I actually read when I was doing fieldwork. So it was super frustrating that indigenous communities were talking to me about the impact of lithium extraction. And then on that very day, Elon Musk tweeted this, where he says that basically price of lithium has gone to insane levels. Tesla might actually have to get into the mining and refining directly at scale unless costs improve. There is no shortage of the element itself, as lithium is almost everywhere on Earth, but pace of extraction refinement is slow. I would say that for local communities, this has been nothing but slow, especially since 2015, where they have seen many new projects opening and so on. So we can see here a very stark contrast between two different groups. Okay, so what are what I identify in these two cases? The first element is elemental framing. So this is a strategy that both of them are undertaking. What do I mean by this? Mainly that framing the problem in terms of water, basically, or the large scale use of water. And this, of course, as I said, this could be an objective fact, but also an strategic decision. So, for example, in the case of Mosacat, this group in Santiago, the capital, opposing the data center, they have the word water in the name of the group. They also organized a water festival. They participate in the World Water Day and so on. So they feel super identified with the water justice cause more broadly. And they made the so to speak, the strategic decision of bringing up water more than other facts or problems associated with data centers. So as one of them told me, for example, I know about digital rights, but we did not include that in our fights. Water impresses people quicker. Or as other person told me, the other thing, digital rights or privacy, for example, we can think of other problems associated with the management of data and Google specifically. The other thing is like, okay, you are seeing ghosts where there are none. So they basically thought that if they talk about privacy to neighbors, for example, they would think that they were, being too specific or obscure about their critique. So what is more clear is more evident in itself. And finally, as another one told me, it is easier for them to understand and feel the effects on water. You won't be able to flush the WC, get a shower, wash your clothes. And the same can be said when it comes to Lickan Antay people. And this is super clear. I love this quote because, as one of them told me, people call it water mining, not lithium mining. So in this way, I think they're kind of bringing up what's the actual consequence for the Atacama Desert, which is this lack of water. And they also told me that their, or lithium companies' final goal is to make extraction sustainable, but the main issue in the value chain is water. And again, they will compare this interest in extracting water with other needs of the communities. So at COP25 back in 2019 in Madrid, Spain, they made a sort of they presented about this issue. And if you look at what they said, for example, the by then president of the Council of Atacameño people said, our communities, our people are extinguishing because of water extraction. We are leaving people without water in order to enjoy these electronic devices. So in this case, it actually becomes a matter of survival. The other element of elemental resistance is ontological disruption, and this only pertains to the case of indigenous communities. By ontology, again, people close to STS might already be familiar with it, but by an ontology means what something is. Disputes about what something is, what is its relation with the outside world, and so on. So in this case, I would say that the extraction of lithium, for example, in the Atacama Desert is bringing about a different ontology of water that is opposed to the one held by the indigenous communities. So let me explain this point with a quote by a local activist. As this activist told me, for the Lickan Antay people, water is essential. It is a resource. It's funny how this person uses the word essential, which could be a synonymous of elemental. It is the resource that allowed them to live. There is a relationship between Lickan Antay people, water, land, and the sacred mountains. In this cosmovision, water is acknowledged as the veins of the Mother Earth. It is sacred. We're in one of the most arid deserts of the world, but despite that, water, in the way our grandparents would treat it and take care of it, made it possible to have the peoples we have today. So in this case, for example, we can see a relational ontology where the actual survival or existence of the communities depend on the relationship with water. And of course, the large-scale extraction of water goes completely against this ontology. So it can also be understood as an attack against this indigenous ontology. So that's the second element. And then the third one is elemental justice. So this is not only about how these projects are affecting the community and so on, but how are they asymmetrically privileging certain actors in detriment of other ones. It is about distribution. It is about injustice and so on. In the case of the data center, they drew on a slogan that was circulating in the country by different water activists, and that became quite famous back in 2019 because in the context of droughts in the country. And what they said basically is that this isn't a drought, this is a robbery. So that was a very famous, as I said, slogan circulating in the country that poses a problem not as a natural only problem, but as a cause, as one that has a human cause, you know, as some people are appropriating this resource. They talked also about freeing the water, for example, and you can see that there is a graphic translation of this message as well. So on the left, you can see a school of Google appropriating all the water of Cerrillos, the neighborhood. And on the right, you can see a woman that is chained in a way. And this woman is the water woman, as they call it. They thought of this woman on purpose because they wanted to connect with the feminist cause as well, which was also having like a lot of importance at that point in Chile, Argentina, and other Latin American countries. So this is how I think they are framing the issue as one of elemental justice. And the same can be said in relation to the Lickan Antay Indigenous communities. So as one of them told me, we can't be a sacrifice zone. Usually sacrifice zones face impacts almost immediately, but it's a slow death in here. Slow. So they're comparing the situation with other regions in the country facing probably more urgent drought, but for them it's also similar. So sacrifice zone is again a very as a concept that circulates in the left in Latin America for places that have been affected by extractivism, which could be mining, for example, and so on. And as another activist told me, it's because the reason why these companies come to Chile is because it's cheaper to extract lithium here. Here they have the sun's energy, they put it in pools where there is the water, which evaporates and the salts remain. That's why Andean saltpeters are more convenient. And here in Chile, there is also a flexible regulation. So you can see how these companies are taking advantage of the situation in Chile because it's cheaper, there is less regulation, and so on. And because it's true that there is lithium in many other regions in Europe, there are some discussions, Portugal or Serbia, for example. But the main sites of extraction remains in Latin America at the moment and Australia. And one aspect of environmental justice that they also brought to the fore quite a lot was the information asymmetries involving these forms of extraction or the construction of the data center. So in the case of the data center, they told me that when they read the report for the first time, they realized that this data center was going to use 169 liters per second of water. So that is a lot. It's also actually similar to the same amount that all the community will use in a day. So they could do a lot of, efforts in order to use less water, but the scale of the water use of this data center was completely out of their hands. And as another activist told me, imagine that they will deliver water through water trucks. We don't have any certainty. That's why I keep asking for a hydrogeological study. I ask for it everywhere I go. So this activist told me that they actually don't have an estimate of how much water there is available for the Cerrillos area. They use underground water, but there is no study specifying how much water remains there for them. So in the case this Google data center get constructed, they might have run out of water for the whole community, and they will have had to rely on water trucks, which is also a situation that is happening in some communities in Chile already. And in the case of Lickan Antay people, they also focus a lot on information regarding availability of water and so on. In this case, the estimated amount of water used not only by lithium extraction, but also by copper extraction in the area is around 4,500 liters of water per second. And actually, at the moment, they are undertaking their own research projects in partnership with some universities. But for them, that's a priority at the moment, to conduct these studies in order to identify how risky it is, the extraction of lithium in the area. And I'm going to read the final quote because I find it super interesting of how clear it is. They say, one of them told me, there are many things we still need to understand in relation to water, but the Germans will say we do it because we understand the supply chain and the regulation. So basically, they consider that some of the mining companies, some of which are from Germany, think that they know, but in practice, people inhabiting this area feel that they don't know enough in order to continue with these projects. So there are very important epistemological questions here about who can know, who thinks that knows, and so on. So that's what I call information asymmetries, one aspect of this elemental resistance. So now going back to the concept that I introduced at the beginning, what do I mean by elemental resistance? So I think that elemental resistance represents an emergent strategy to combat terricidal technologies. It focuses on the constituents part of both nature and technology, the interactions between them, and their consequences for human and community life. So that's basically a definition of elemental resistance. And as we saw, it involves mainly three aspects: an elemental framing, which is basically framing the problem as one related to the elements of both technology and nature; an ontological disruption, especially in the case of indigenous communities; and elemental justice, including information asymmetries. But the question, and this is the final slide, why does it matter? Why should we keep talking about elemental resistance? I think what is interesting about this is how activists are mobilizing a particular element, water, in different ways. I don't know, in this case, for example, the water woman, the chained woman, or the school of Google, or relying on ancestral knowledges about water. So that's why I understand as mobilizing water in order to mobilize human, because they understand that if they bring up water as an issue, local people will understand more clearly the consequences of the construction of a data center or the extraction of lithium. And also, I think that if we think in relation to, for example, digital rights activism or hacker activism, elemental resistance that signifies and brings technology resistance home. It makes it, it speaks to the level of the neighborhood, of the community and territory. And I think that's something that makes it easier to understand, again, the impact of the environmental impact of digital technologies. As I already said, it focuses on constituent parts. It doesn't look at the whole, in this case, of nature and technology, which also makes it more graspable in a way, more easier to address. But it is also vital, and this is especially the case when it comes to the indigenous communities who are already talking about extinction, for example, or the fact that they might have to migrate to somewhere else in the future. So it speaks to human and community survival. And finally, it can infuse social justice in the whole chain of technology development. So it allows us to look at the different components that makes up technology, the elements of technology, and how these different elements of technology are interacting with nature and communities in different ways. The only, I would say, limitation that I identified when it comes to elemental resistance is that it doesn't necessarily involve an alternative proposal, basically. So the two communities that I studied, none of them are interested in, for example, thinking of alternative forms of collecting and processing data, in the case of the data center, or how so-called green technologies can involve less extraction. So at the moment, this type of resistance has become super local. And in this case, I think that what could be interesting in order to think of alternative models will be to establish partnerships, for example, with hacker communities, with digital rights activists, with academia, and so on. But at the moment, I would say that the elemental resistance is super focused on the impact of technology on the environment and specific communities. rather than focusing on proposing alternative models. We can think of that this is not their job, basically, but I think that it would be super interesting to include this type of resistance when we think of alternative models of technology. So that's it. Thank you.